Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Christopher Dane had spent 12 years cataloging the rational. Every incident report, every search and rescue operation, every unexplained disappearance in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness eventually resolved into something explicable. Hypothermia, drowning, bear attacks, simple human error compounded by a million acres of unforgiving boreal forest. He'd built his reputation on this methodology, on the careful dissection of panic into data points, on transforming wilderness mystery into bureaucratic certainty, which was why the spreadsheet on his monitor that October afternoon felt like a slow-developing photograph of something he didn't want to see. The fluorescent lights in the ranger station hummed their monotonous note. Outside, Lake Superior's autumn wind scraped against the windows of the Grand Marais office, carrying the smell of dying leaves and ice forming on distant waters. Christopher leaned back in his chair, the springs protesting, and rubbed his eyes beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. The numbers didn't change. Rachel Morrison, 28, aquatic biologist from the University of Minnesota, had missed her scheduled radio check-in 3 days ago. Her research permit placed her somewhere in the Lac La Croix region, studying seasonal pH variations in remote lake systems. Standard procedure. She'd been alone, which wasn't unusual for doctoral research. What was unusual, what made Christopher's methodical mind stumble over itself, was the pattern her disappearance completed. He'd pulled the records going back 30 years, something he did reflexively now, a habit born from thoroughness rather than suspicion. The Boundary Waters saw its share of missing persons, roughly 2 to 3 per year across its vast territory, most found within 72 hours, some never found at all. Normal statistical variation for a wilderness area that drew over 150,000 visitors annually. But filtering the data by location, by season, by circumstance, something emerged that his rational mind wanted to dismiss as coincidence even as his hands went cold against the keyboard. Every 7 years, almost to the month, someone vanished from the northwestern quadrant of the wilderness. October, sometimes late September. Always alone. Always experienced outdoorsmen or researchers, never tourists who'd simply gotten lost. The disappearances traced back to 1977, possibly earlier. The records before that were incomplete, stored in water-damaged filing cabinets in the basement. 1977, Michael Christensen, wildlife surveyor, 34. 1984, Jennifer O'Brien, forestry technician, 29. 1991, David Kopechne, geologist, 41. 1998, Thomas Ashford, fisheries biologist, 36. 2005, Amanda Chen, hydrologist, 32. And now, 2007, Rachel Morrison. Christopher's Motorola radio crackled. "Dane, you copy?" Sarah Lightfoot's voice, his fellow ranger, probably wondering why he'd been staring at his computer for 3 hours. He pressed the transmit button. "Yeah, I'm here. Weather service is calling for an early freeze tonight. Temps dropping to 22 degrees. If you're planning on heading out for Morrison tomorrow, you'll want to start at first light. Ice is already forming on the smaller lakes." "Copy that." He released the button, then pressed it again. "Sarah, how long have you been working this territory?" A pause. 15 years, why? "You remember a hydrologist who went missing in 2005? Amanda Chen?" The radio silence stretched long enough that Christopher thought he'd lost the signal. Then, "I was the one who found her gear, or what was left of it. Why are you asking about Amanda?" "Just following up on Morrison, doing background research." Another pause. "Chris, Amanda Chen wasn't like the others. What we found..." Sarah's voice dropped, became something Christopher had never heard from her before, something that approached actual unease. "The tent was shredded, not by bears. I've seen plenty of bear damage. This was different, more methodical, and the cold. It was October, just like now. But that sight, she didn't finish." "What about the body?" Never found one, just the gear, her research notes scattered across 50 yards of forest, and... She stopped. And what? Ask Henry Whitefeather. He was the guide who took me in there. He might remember better than I do. Christopher made a note. Henry Whitefeather, local Ojibwe elder, occasionally contracted by the Park Service for his knowledge of the deeper wilderness. Thanks, Sarah. Chris, be careful out there. There's something about that northwestern section. Always has been. The old-timers, they don't go in there during fall. There's a reason for that. The radio clicked off before he could respond. Christopher printed the spreadsheet. The laser printer's whir sounding too loud in the empty office. He stared at the list of names, 6 people across 30 years, and felt something he'd trained himself out of feeling. The specific discomfort of pattern recognition when the pattern made no logical sense. His mind tried to construct explanations. Serial killer with peculiar timing, dangerous wildlife with cyclical migration patterns, geological hazards that manifested seasonally, but each theory collapsed under the weight of probability. He pulled Rachel Morrison's file. Her photo showed a woman with intelligent eyes and sun-weathered skin, someone comfortable in wilderness spaces. Her research proposal was meticulous. A 3-week solo expedition studying anthropogenic impacts on pristine lake systems, specifically focusing on atmospheric mercury deposition. She'd included detailed itinerary maps, emergency protocols, satellite phone numbers, everything correct, everything professional. Her last radio transmission, 3 days ago. Day 17, all equipment functional, pH readings from Curtain Falls completed, moving northeast toward Lac La Croix, weather holding, no concerns. Nothing in her voice suggesting distress. Just another routine day in the wilderness for someone who'd spent summers in remote field research since her undergraduate years. Christopher looked at the map on his wall, studied the topography of the northwestern quadrant. The Lac La Croix region was about as remote as the Boundary Waters got, a maze of interconnected lakes, black spruce bogs, and granite ridges along the Canadian border. Few people ventured that deep, especially not in late October. The portages were brutal, some climbing 300 vertical feet over rough terrain. The Ojibwe had names for these places, old names that predated European exploration by centuries. He made another note. Talk to Whitefeather before heading in. Outside, the wind intensified, rattling the station's windows in their frames. The sun was setting earlier now, autumn dragging the light down before 5 o'clock. Christopher saved his files, locked his computer, and pulled on his jacket. The parking lot was empty except for his truck, a weathered Ford Ranger with 140,000 miles and a cargo bed full of rescue equipment that he'd probably need to refresh before morning. He was halfway to his vehicle when his phone rang. Not his cell, the reception out here was useless, but his work satellite phone, the chunky Iridium unit that cost $12 per minute and only got used for emergencies. Dane. Mr. Dane, this is Susan Morrison, Rachel's mother. The voice was controlled but fragile, like ice barely holding weight. Have you found anything? Please, I know it's only been 3 days, but Rachel always checks in. She's never late with communications. Never. Something's wrong. Christopher leaned against his truck, felt the cold metal through his jacket. Mrs. Morrison, I'm heading out at first light tomorrow to her last known location. I'll find her. Rachel's an experienced wilderness researcher. Sometimes communication equipment fails or... She called me. The mother's voice broke the careful control. The night before she missed her check-in. She called on her satellite phone, said something was wrong with the forest. Christopher straightened. Wrong how? She said the sounds weren't right. Said she kept hearing something in the trees, something that didn't match any wildlife she knew. And she said it was too cold. That's what she kept saying. It's too cold, Mom. It shouldn't be this cold yet. Susan Morrison's breathing became uneven. My daughter has a master's degree in ecology. She's been in the field for 7 years. She doesn't imagine things. If she said something was wrong, something was wrong. Christopher wrote this down on the small notepad he always carried. Did she say anything else? She said the ice was forming too fast, that she'd seen a lake freeze over in less than 6 hours, which apparently is impossible. And then she said, the woman's voice dropped to a whisper. She said she'd found something. Old campsite maybe, but wrong. She said it felt like a place where people had stopped being people. Those were her exact words. Then the connection cut out. I haven't heard from her since. After he ended the call, Christopher sat in his truck for a long time, engine running, heater blasting against the October cold. He pulled out his topographic maps, spread them across the passenger seat, and traced Rachel's planned route with his finger. She would have been somewhere between Curtain Falls and the main body of Lac La Croix when she made that call. That narrowed the search area to maybe 40 square miles of brutal terrain. He thought about the spreadsheet, about 6 names across 30 years, about Sarah's unfinished sentence regarding Amanda Chen's campsite. He thought about Susan Morrison's voice breaking as she repeated her daughter's words. A place where people had stopped being people. Christopher had spent his entire career finding rational explanations. Tomorrow, he would find Rachel Morrison, alive or dead, and there would be an explanation. There always was. He just wished his hands would stop shaking as he drove home through the deepening dark, past forests that seemed to lean closer to the road than they had that morning, their shadows moving in ways that had nothing to do with the wind. The temperature dropped 12 degrees overnight. By the time Christopher loaded his canoe onto his truck the next morning, frost covered everything in crystalline white. The meteorological reports called it unusual but not unprecedented. A cold front pushing down from Hudson Bay, early season Arctic air bringing winter ahead of schedule. Perfectly explainable. He'd called Henry Whitefeather at 6 a.m., waking the old man from sleep. Whitefeather had agreed to meet him at the Highway 61 boat launch at 7, his voice carrying a weight that Christopher hadn't heard before, something almost like resignation. The old Ojibwe elder was waiting when Christopher arrived, standing beside a battered pickup that was older than Christopher himself. Whitefeather was in his 70s now, but still moved with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime in wilderness. His face was weathered leather, his eyes the color of dark water, and when he looked at Christopher, it was with an expression that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for a very long time. You're going after the biologist, Whitefeather said. Not a question. Rachel Morrison, yeah. Christopher began unloading his gear. Grumman canoe, Duluth pack with 7 days of supplies, emergency beacon, Garmin GPS unit, waterproof maps, satellite phone, first aid kit, emergency bivouac equipment, standard search protocol. Sarah mentioned you guided her to the Amanda Chen site in 2005. Whitefeather watched Christopher work, made no move to help. That's right. She said there was something unusual about it. She say what? No. Said I should ask you. The old man looked out across the water, toward the maze of lakes and forests that stretched to the horizon. My grandfather used to tell stories about the northwestern lakes, said they belonged to the Wendigo. You know that word? Christopher had heard it vaguely. Some kind of Native American legend. Algonquian, specifically Ojibwe in these territories. Whitefeather's voice was even, factual, like he was discussing weather patterns. Spirit of winter, of famine, of cannibalism. It's what happens when a human being becomes so consumed by hunger, physical or otherwise, that they lose their humanity, transform into something else, something that's always hungry, always cold, and can never be satisfied. He looked at Christopher directly. Your rational mind is going to want to dismiss this as folklore. I can see it in your face. You're already categorizing this conversation as cultural superstition, something to nod along with and ignore. Daniel Torres pressed his thumb against the power button of his Garmin E-Trex GPS unit, watching the screen flicker to life with the sluggish reluctance typical of October mornings in the Hoh rainforest. The device showed his coordinates with its usual 200-foot margin of error, which meant he was somewhere near the junction of the Hoh River Trail and the abandoned mining road that hadn't appeared on official park maps since 1974. Close enough. The temperature read 41 degrees, though the moisture-laden air made it feel colder. The kind of cold that worked its way beneath your skin and settled into your bones like an unwelcome tenant. He'd been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 12 years, and in that time he'd learned to trust the forest's silences more than its sounds. Right now, the Ho was too quiet. No varied thrushes calling from the Sitka spruce canopy. No Douglas squirrels chattering their territorial disputes. Even the ever-present drip of condensation from the moss-draped branches seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Daniel clicked the transmit button on his Motorola XTS 2500. "Dispatch, this is Torres. I'm approximately half a mile from the Hartley site. Weather's holding, but visibility is poor. Over." Static crackled, then Linda's voice emerged, tinny and distant. "Copy that, Daniel. Family's been calling every hour. They want updates. Tell them I'll do everything I can." He released the button before she could respond with the sympathy he didn't want to hear. Kevin Hartley had been missing for 4 days. In Daniel's experience, after 96 hours in the Olympic wilderness, you were either looking for someone who didn't want to be found or someone who would never be found at all. The trail narrowed as he pushed deeper into the old growth. Big leaf maples formed a skeletal canopy overhead, their branches twisted into arthritic angles, each one supporting what looked like 50 pounds of club moss and licorice fern. The understory was a claustrophobic tangle of salal and sword ferns, their fronds brushing against his uniform pants and leaving dark streaks of moisture. Everything here was wet. The bark of the trees wept. The air itself seemed to have weight and substance. Daniel had been 11 the first time he'd felt it. That peculiar sensation of standing in a room and knowing, absolutely knowing, that he wasn't alone. His grandmother had called it El Don, the gift, though she'd said the word with a mixture of pride and pity that had confused him. His mother had taken him to doctors who'd prescribed medications he'd learned to hide under his tongue. By the time he'd entered the academy, he'd trained himself to rationalize the sensations away. Electromagnetic fields, low-frequency sound waves, infrasound from geological activity. There was always a scientific explanation, if you looked hard enough. But he'd never been able to fully silence the part of him that knew better. The sensation started as he rounded a massive western hemlock, its trunk wider than his arm span, a pressure behind his eyes, like the beginnings of a migraine, a taste in his mouth like copper and old stone. He stopped, one hand instinctively moving to the pepper spray on his belt, though he knew from experience that whatever he was sensing wouldn't be deterred by capsaicin. The encampment appeared through the fog like something emerging from underwater. A blue REI quarter-dome tent, its rainfly shredded and flapping in a breeze Daniel couldn't feel on his skin. The tent's body was torn from the inside. Long, ragged gashes that suggested desperate hands rather than animal claws. A camp stove sat upright on a flat stone. A pot of water still balanced on top. The surface covered with a film of pollen and debris that spoke of days of exposure. Daniel approached slowly, his boots sinking into the moss-covered ground with soft, sucking sounds. The trees here were different, older, their bark blackened with age, limbs extending at angles that seemed to defy the forest's usual geometry. He pulled a digital camera from his pack, a Canon PowerShot that the park had issued last year, and began documenting the scene. The tent interior revealed Kevin's sleeping bag, unzipped and thrashed aside. A backpack lay overturned, its contents scattered. A water filter, energy bar wrappers, a dog-eared paperback of Kerouac's On the Road. Daniel photographed everything, maintaining the professional distance he'd cultivated over years of search and rescue operations. But his hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. Around the tent's perimeter, something dark stained the moss. Daniel knelt, touching the substance with a gloved finger. Blood. But not random. The stains formed a pattern, almost a border, as if someone had deliberately marked the boundary of the campsite. He stood following the line with his eyes and felt his stomach contract. Symbols, carved into the bark of 6 surrounding trees at chest height, fresh enough that sap still bled from the wounds. Not random scratches, deliberate marks, angular and purposeful. Daniel had seen petroglyphs at various sites throughout the park, ancient marks left by Quinault and Quileute peoples. But these were different. European, if he had to guess. Each one contained elements that reminded him of letters, but from no alphabet he recognized. He photographed them methodically, trying to ignore the way his vision seemed to blur at the edges when he looked at them directly. The pressure behind his eyes intensified. Inside the tent, he found Kevin's journal, a cheap, spiral-bound notebook with a water-damaged cover. Daniel sat back on his heels and opened it, flipping past entries about hiking plans and complaints about mosquitoes until he reached the final pages. October 12th. Something's wrong with this place. I keep dreaming about being underground. Not buried alive exactly, but resting, like I'm supposed to be there. When I wake up, I smell dirt and something else, something rotten. October 13th. Found an old cemetery about a mile northeast of here, not on any map. Maybe 20 graves, most of the markers broken or fallen over. The ones I could read had Romanian names. One said, Aishi se odinește, which I looked up. It means, here rests. Felt weird being there, like I was being watched from below rather than from the trees. October 14th. Can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see a man standing at the edge of the firelight. But when I look directly, there's nothing. I swear I can hear digging sounds at night, like someone excavating with their hands. I put those marks on the trees, found them in a book about European folklore at the library before I left. They're supposed to be protective. I feel insane writing this. The entry ended there, the pen trailing off the page. Daniel felt something cold uncoil in his chest. The date was October 14th. Today was October 18th. 4 days of silence after that final entry. He keyed his radio. Dispatch, I've located the Hartley campsite. I need you to pull up any historical records we have about mining operations or settlements in this area, particularly any Romanian or Eastern European communities. Also, see if we have archaeological surveys mentioning burial sites off the main trail system. Copy, that's specific. What are you thinking? Just covering bases. He signed off before she could press further. The truth, that he was following the paranoid scrawlings of a missing teenager who'd apparently convinced himself he was being haunted, would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. Daniel stood, shouldering his pack. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility to perhaps 30 feet. The forest silence pressed against his eardrums. He pulled out his compass, took a bearing northeast, and started walking. The cemetery revealed itself gradually, as if the forest was reluctant to give up its secret. First, a depression in the ground that was too regular to be natural. Then, a stone marker leaning at a 45-degree angle, its surface covered with lichen, but still bearing the carved image of an Orthodox cross with 3 horizontal bars. More stones emerged from the undergrowth as Daniel pushed forward. Rough-hewn markers, some barely more than field stones with names chiseled into them. He counted 23 graves in total, arranged in no particular pattern that he could discern. The legible markers bore names: Popescu, Ionescu, Dumitrescu, dates ranging from 1891 to 1897. Someone had cleared this ground once, cut back the salal and ferns to create a proper burial ground, but that had been more than a century ago. Now the forest was reclaiming its territory with patient inevitability. But someone had been here recently. Daniel crouched beside a grave near the cemetery's center. The earth here was disturbed, broken roots and displaced soil suggesting recent excavation. Not from animals. The hole was too deliberate, too focused. Someone had dug here, had dug deep, perhaps 6 feet down, and then had... He leaned closer, his stomach nodding. The hole wasn't empty. At the bottom, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the canopy, he could see fragments of wood, rotted and soft with decay, a coffin, or what remained of one. And inside, Daniel jerked back, his boot slipping on the wet moss. His camera dropped from nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud. Because there was nothing inside the coffin, nothing but grave clothes, collapsed and empty, and the unmistakable impression of a body that had once occupied that space and had somehow departed. The pressure behind his eyes became a spike of pain. Daniel gasped, pressing his palms against his temples. The sensation that had been with him since entering the forest intensified until it felt like his skull was being compressed in a vice. Through the pain, he became aware of something else, a presence, multiple presences, arranged in a circle around the cemetery's perimeter. Not close, not yet, but watching, waiting. He forced himself to breathe, to push past the supernatural static that threatened to overwhelm his senses. This was what he'd spent decades trying to suppress, trying to rationalize away. But here, in this forgotten graveyard where someone or something had violated the sanctity of the dead, there was no rationalizing. Kevin Hartley had stumbled onto something that predated the National Park Service, predated the logging companies, predated everything but the trees themselves. Daniel retrieved his camera, hands still shaking, and photographed the exhumed grave. Then he pulled out his GPS unit and marked the coordinates, though he doubted anyone else would ever need to find this place. The Garmin showed his position as 47.8145 degree N, 123.9372 degree W, elevation 847 feet. Numbers that represented location but conveyed nothing about the wrongness that permeated this ground. His radio crackled. "Daniel, I've got something. There was a Romanian mining community here in the 1890s. They were working a small copper vein about 2 miles from your current position. According to the records, there was some kind of incident in 1897. The mine was abandoned suddenly and the community dispersed. The report's vague, but it mentions widespread illness and necessary quarantine measures. Any details about what kind of illness? Nothing specific. But there's a note here that the county sheriff's office ordered several bodies exhumed and destroyed by fire. The word used is destroyed, not buried. That's unusual." Daniel felt his mouth go dry. "Thanks, Linda. I'm going to continue searching the area. I'll check in every hour. Be careful out there." He signed off and stood, scanning the cemetery one more time. The disturbed grave wasn't the only one. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see evidence of excavation at 4 other sites, each one displaying the same pattern. Earth removed, coffin breached, contents absent. 5 empty graves. 5 somethings that had been interred and were interred no longer. The Romanian words from Kevin's journal echoed in his mind. "Aici se odihnește," here rests. Past tense. Because whatever had been resting here was resting no more. Daniel turned slowly, examining the trees surrounding the cemetery. He found what he was looking for on a massive Sitka spruce, symbols carved into the bark, identical to those around Kevin's campsite. But these were older, the cuts weathered and darkened with age. Someone from that original Romanian community had marked these trees, had tried to bind something to this ground. And Kevin, in his desperate terror, had replicated the marks without understanding their purpose or their failure. A sound reached him through the fog, a wet, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled through undergrowth. Daniel's hand went to his pepper spray again, a gesture he recognized as futile even as he made it. The noise came from his left, perhaps 50 yards away, but the fog made it impossible to pinpoint. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no dripping water, no distant bird calls. The forest had become a cathedral of held breath. Daniel started walking, not back toward the trail, but deeper into the old growth, following an intuition that was more than intuition. The sensitives in his grandmother's village in New Mexico had called it La Llamada, the calling. The dead called to the living, particularly to those who could hear them. And right now Daniel could feel the pull like a hook behind his sternum. The terrain sloped downward, becoming increasingly treacherous. Nurse logs as thick as cars blocked his path, their surfaces covered with communities of moss and sprouting hemlocks. He climbed over one and found himself in a depression that might have been natural or might have been excavated. The ground here was different, loose and dark, as if it had been turned recently. In the center of the depression, he found Kevin Hartley's boot, just the boot, standing upright, still laced, positioned with deliberate care. Daniel approached it like he might approach an IED, every muscle tense. He knelt, examining the ground around it without touching anything. No blood, no signs of struggle, just the boot, and beside it, partially buried in the loose soil, Kevin's cell phone. Daniel extracted the phone carefully, hoping against hope that it might power on despite 4 days of exposure. The Nokia flipped open, its battery indicator showing a quarter charge. 3 bars of no service stared back at him, but the phone itself was functional. He navigated to the photo gallery. The images loaded slowly, their resolution poor by modern standards but clear enough. Kevin had documented his exploration of the cemetery. Shots of grave markers, close-ups of names and dates. Then a series of photos taken at night, the flash bleaching everything into harsh contrast. The first showed the camp at dusk, the fire burning, Kevin's shadow long against the tent. The next photo showed the same scene, but now there was a second shadow. Daniel felt his throat constrict. The shadow was wrong, too tall, proportions distorted, cast at an angle that didn't match the firelight. It stretched across the ground toward the tent, ending at the entrance flap. He advanced to the next image. This one was shakier, taken in haste. It showed the forest at night, the flash illuminating maybe 15 feet of trees and undergrowth. At the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a figure. Pale skin, dark clothes, or perhaps no clothes at all, the image too degraded to be certain. What was certain was the posture, a crouch, arms extended, head cocked at an angle that suggested either curiosity or predatory assessment. The final photo was almost entirely dark. Kevin must have taken it while running, the camera aimed behind him. But the flash had caught something, eyes reflecting the light with the yellow-green shine of a nocturnal animal, but positioned too high off the ground. And behind the eyes, visible only because of the specific angle and the momentary illumination, was a face that Daniel's rational mind tried and failed to categorize as human. He dropped the phone, his hand moving of its own accord. The taste of copper in his mouth intensified, and with it came a wave of nausea so powerful he had to brace himself against a tree to avoid falling. The presences he'd sensed earlier were closer now, much closer, forming a tightening perimeter around his position. Through the gray afternoon light, Daniel saw movement. Not one figure, but several, their motions deliberate and coordinated. They emerged from behind trees, materialized from pockets of deeper fog, their approach silent and inexorable. As they came closer, details resolved with nightmare clarity. They had been people once. The tattered remains of clothing suggested the 1890s. Simple work garments, long rotted to fragments. But the bodies inside those clothes were wrong in ways that violated every principle of decomposition Daniel understood. Flesh that should have been dust remained, drawn tight over bone, gray-white and mottled with patches of darkness that might have been grave mold. Eyes that should have been empty sockets glinted with awareness and hunger. Mouths hung open, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp, modified by death into something designed for tearing. 5 of them, corresponding to the 5 opened graves. The closest one, perhaps 40 feet away and closing, wore the remnants of a once white shirt and dark trousers. A brass belt buckle gleamed dully at its waist, the only bright thing about it. As Daniel watched, frozen in a paralysis that was part terror and part that peculiar helplessness that comes from seeing something your mind has no framework to process, the creature's head turned with mechanical precision until its gaze fixed directly on him. Its mouth moved. Sound emerged, though whether it came from the throat or from somewhere deeper was impossible to determine. The words were in Romanian, he thought, or something close to it, but the syllables were wrong, distorted by a vocal apparatus that was no longer entirely human. View, it said, the word somewhere between statement and question. Alive. Daniel's paralysis broke. He ran. The forest became a blur of green and gray, obstacles appearing from the fog too late to avoid cleanly. He crashed through undergrowth, vaulted over fallen logs, his boots finding purchase on moss-slick bark through pure luck. Behind him he could hear them giving chase, and the sound of their pursuit was worse than any animal's because it retained terrible elements of humanity. Footfalls that had rhythm, breath that came in measured draws, coordination that spoke of intelligence and purpose. His radio was in his hand without conscious thought. "Dispatch, emergency!" He gasped into it, not bothering with protocol. "Hartley site, northeast quarter mile, contact with..." What? What could he possibly say? "Hostiles. Multiple hostiles. I need immediate backup." Static answered him. He glanced at the display. No signal. The mountains blocked transmission or something else did. Daniel shoved the radio back into his belt and focused on navigation, trying to orient himself toward the main trail, toward ranger stations and other human beings in the rational world that seemed impossibly distant now. The trees opened suddenly into a clearing he didn't recognize. Daniel stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving, and realized his mistake. He'd been herded. The creatures hadn't been chasing him so much as directing him, using his own panic to guide him to this place. The clearing was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, and in its center stood a structure that explained everything and explained nothing. A stone marker, larger and more elaborate than those in the cemetery, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around it, the ground was disturbed in a pattern that suggested repeated ritual use. A circle of cleared earth, blackened stones arranged at cardinal points, and at the marker's base, offerings. Recent offerings. Daniel's vision swam as he recognized Kevin Hartley's wallet, his watch, his camp knife. They'd been arranged with care, positioned alongside older objects, a corroded compass, buttons from ancient clothing, a child's shoe so small it made his heart ache. This was a feeding place or a worship place or both. The creatures entered the clearing from multiple points simultaneously, their movements coordinated with pack intelligence. They formed a loose semicircle blocking any retreat back the way he'd come. Daniel's back was against the stone marker, his options reduced to zero. The one with the brass belt buckle spoke again, that same distorted Romanian, but this time Daniel's mind, pushed past reason into the hyper-awareness that sometimes accompanies mortal terror, grasped fragments of meaning. It was asking him something, about the markers, about Kevin's attempts at protection. "I don't know what you want," Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. His hand had found the utility knife on his belt, a 4-inch blade that would be as effective as harsh language against what he was facing. The creature tilted its head, the gesture disconcertingly human. Then it raised one arm, the movement slow and deliberate, and pointed past Daniel toward the marker. Daniel risked a glance over his shoulder. The stone was covered in text, carved in a language he didn't recognize, but that had the liturgical quality of Church Latin or Old Church Slavonic. At the top was a date, 1897. Below it, more text, and beneath that, names. 23 of them, corresponding to the graves in the cemetery. This wasn't a feeding place. It was a prison. Understanding hit him with physical force. The Romanian community hadn't been devastated by illness. They'd been dealing with something older, something they'd brought with them from the old country or awakened in this new land. These 5 had been identified, isolated, destroyed according to tradition, staked, perhaps, or decapitated, then interred with proper rites to keep them bound to the earth. And someone, whether through ignorance or malice, had broken those bindings, had dug them up, released them from whatever occult chains had held them dormant for more than a century. Kevin, Daniel breathed. He didn't understand. He was just a kid who read about folklore and thought the symbols would protect him. But he didn't know they were already, that you were already. The creature's expression didn't change because it was incapable of expression. But Daniel felt its confirmation like a cold weight in his chest. Kevin had found the cemetery, had disturbed the graves out of naive curiosity or misguided academic interest, and in doing so, he'd unmade a century of careful containment. "Where is he?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. You didn't survive becoming someone's first meal after 100 years of hunger. The creature with the brass buckle moved closer, near enough now that Daniel could smell it. Earth and rot and something underneath that was purely chemical, the scent of a body in the wrong kind of preservation. It reached out with one hand and Daniel saw that the nails were intact, yellowed and thick, curved slightly inward like the claws they'd become. The hand touched Daniel's chest, directly over his heart. The contact sent a shock through his entire nervous system. Not painful but intensely wrong, as if his body recognized on a cellular level that this touch came from something that had crossed a boundary the living weren't meant to cross. "Simsi," the creature said. "You feel," and Daniel understood. It had sensed what he was, had recognized in him the same quality that had made Kevin vulnerable, the ability to perceive what others couldn't. to exist partially in the space between the material and the immaterial. To the Strigoi, because that's what they were, Daniel knew now with absolute certainty, he was visible in a way other humans weren't. More substantial, more nourishing. "I'm not what you need," Daniel said, forcing the words past the paralysis creeping through his limbs. The creature's touch was draining something from him, not blood, but something more fundamental. "If you kill me, more will come. They'll find this place. They'll..." The creature withdrew its hand, and Daniel nearly collapsed with relief. It spoke again, the syllables coming in a string that sounded almost like negotiation. Daniel's grandmother had told him once that the dead remembered bargains, honored old contracts, operated according to rules that the living had forgotten. If that was true, if there was any truth at all in the folklore Kevin had tried and failed to wield, then maybe there was a way out of this that didn't end with him becoming another set of offerings at the base of a forgotten stone. "You want to be rebound," Daniel said slowly, working it out as he spoke. "The marker kept you contained and now it's broken. You need someone who can feel the right way to remake it. Someone sensitive." The creature waited, motionless. Daniel looked at the stone, at the carved symbols that his eyes wanted to slide away from. He thought about Kevin Hartley, 19 years old, armed with library research and good intentions, completely unprepared for the reality of what he'd encountered. He thought about the other people who would come looking for him when he failed to report in, who would wander into this territory without any understanding of what waited here. "If I do this," he said, "you go back. All of you. And you stay down." The creature inclined its head. Agreement, or perhaps simply acknowledgement. Daniel turned to the marker, pulling out his knife. The blade caught the fading light, and in its reflection, he saw himself. Pale, sweat-soaked, eyes too wide. He looked like a man on the edge of breaking. Perhaps he was. The symbols on the stone were elaborate, interweaving patterns that suggested multiple layers of binding. Daniel traced them with his eyes, trying to find the beginning, the thread he could follow. His grandmother's voice echoed in memory. "The dead speak in patterns. Learn to read them, and you learn to speak back." He pressed his palm flat against the stone. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a rush of images and impressions that weren't quite thoughts. The original binding had been performed by someone with real knowledge, a priest or a cunning person who'd understood the necessity of what they were doing. 5 members of the community had died and returned, driven by hunger or curse or the simple momentum of unfinished business. They'd been contained with traditional methods, the physical destruction of the body combined with prayers and symbols designed to anchor the spirit to its burial place. But containment wasn't the same as peace. For over a century, they'd existed in a state between death and unrest, aware but unable to act, until Kevin's innocent trespass had broken the wards. Daniel pulled the camera from his pocket, scrolling through the photos he'd taken of the symbols Kevin had carved. They were approximations copied from some book or website without true understanding. But the intent had been there, the desire for protection. Intent mattered in these workings. Intent and will, and the ability to perceive the boundaries between worlds. He began to carve. Not copying Kevin's marks, but working from the feeling in his palm, from the pattern the stone itself seemed to want to teach him. His knife bit into the bark of the surrounding trees, following designs that seemed to come from somewhere outside his conscious thought. He moved around the clearing, working methodically despite the exhaustion pulling at his limbs and the cold sweat soaking his uniform. The creatures watched. They didn't interfere, but their presence was a constant pressure, a reminder that if he failed, if the binding didn't take, he would join Kevin in feeding them. Daniel tried not to think about what that would feel like. The sensation of his life being drawn out through the point of contact, his vitality becoming nourishment for something that shouldn't exist. The last symbol went into the stone marker itself, carved over the weathered text with shaking hands. As Daniel completed the final line, he felt something shift. Not a physical sensation, but a change in the air, in the weight of the space itself. The clearing that had felt oppressive and wrong began to settle, like a held breath finally released. The creature with the brass buckle looked at Daniel one final time. Its expression, to the extent it could have one, seemed almost grateful. Then it turned and walked toward the stone marker. The others followed, moving in a formation that was almost ceremonial. As they reached the stone, they seemed to diminish, their forms becoming less substantial, more shadow than flesh. One by one, they sank into the earth, not falling or collapsing, but deliberately descending, returning to the graves that had held them for so long. Daniel watched until the last of them, the one with the buckle, disappeared beneath the moss and soil, leaving only a faint depression in the ground. The silence that followed was different from before. Natural. The drip of condensation resumed, and somewhere in the distance, a varied thrush sang its haunting, descending call. Daniel's legs gave out. He sat heavily, his back against the stone marker, and pulled out his radio with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. This time, when he keyed the transmit button, Linda's voice came through clearly. "Daniel? Jesus, we've been trying to reach you for 2 hours. Are you all right?" "I need a recovery team," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "I found evidence of Kevin Hartley. He's deceased. Location is approximately 1 mile northeast of his camp. I'll transmit coordinates." "Copy. Daniel, are you injured? You sound..." "I'm not injured. Just get the team out here. And Linda? I need you to pull any records we have about the disposition of the Romanian cemetery in this sector, particularly any burial customs or restrictions. It's important that we document them." "Okay. Recovery team is mobilizing now. ETA 90 minutes. Stay on this frequency." Daniel signed off and closed his eyes. In his pocket, Kevin's phone felt like a lead weight. He would give it to the recovery team, would let them examine the photos and draw whatever conclusions they wanted. They would find Kevin's remains eventually, or what the forest had left of them. It would be ruled an animal attack most likely, or exposure. The official report would be clean, factual, offering closure to a grieving family. No one would believe the truth. Daniel barely believed it himself, and he'd lived through it. He stood, forcing his exhausted body into motion. The walk back to the trail took an hour, his GPS guiding him through fog that was beginning to lift as evening approached. By the time he reached Kevin's campsite, the recovery team's voices were audible in the distance, calling his name. Daniel looked one last time at the symbols carved into the trees, at the protection marks Kevin had made in desperate ignorance. Then he pulled out his knife and systematically obliterated them, carving over each one until they were unrecognizable. The bindings would hold now, reinforced by his own work in the clearing. But there was no sense in leaving an invitation for the next curious hiker who stumbled across this place. The recovery team found him sitting on a log near the tent, filling out initial incident reports with mechanical precision. They asked if he was all right. He said yes. They asked what he'd found. He told them about the disturbed campsite, the journal entries about nightmares, the evidence of Kevin becoming disoriented and wandering into the forest. All of it true, as far as it went. He did not mention the cemetery, though he marked its coordinates in his personal GPS with a note that read only, "Historical site. Restricted access pending archaeological survey." He did not mention the exhumed graves or the stone marker or the bindings he'd carved by instinct and terror. And he especially did not mention the 5 figures that had returned to their rest, their century of hunger finally satisfied by the boy who'd accidentally released them. 3 weeks later, Daniel Torres submitted his resignation from the National Park Service. The official reason was family obligations. The unofficial reason, the one he gave to exactly no one, was that he could no longer walk into the forest without feeling them beneath his feet, patient and waiting. The bindings would hold, he was almost certain. But almost was a word that had new weight now, and the sensitives in his grandmother's village had always warned that once you truly opened yourself to what lay on the other side, you could never fully close that door again. He moved to Seattle, took a job with the city parks department. Smaller trees, less isolation, the constant presence of other people. It helped. Most days, but sometimes, in the space between waking and sleep, he felt that pressure behind his eyes. And sometimes, when the fog rolled in from Puget Sound and the city became a forest of steel and glass and human ambition, Daniel Torres could swear he heard his name being spoken in a language the dead still remembered, even if the living had forgotten. Aishi Siodi Neshte, the old markers had said. Here rests. But rest was always temporary, and the earth kept its secrets poorly. And in the Ho rainforest, where moss grew over all things and the trees remembered longer than men, 23 graves held their occupants in uneasy stillness, bound by symbols that would last only as long as someone remembered to maintain them. Daniel knew he should tell someone, should leave some kind of record, some explanation for whoever might need it in another century when the bindings weakened again. But he also knew that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. Kevin Hartley had learned that lesson in the worst possible way. So Daniel kept his silence, carried his secrets, and learned to live with the weight of knowing there were things in the deep forests that were older than nations, patient as stone, and hungry in ways that transcended mere physical need. The Ho River flowed on, indifferent to human terror. The trees grew and fell and grew again, and beneath it all, in the darkness under the moss and soil, 5 sleepers rested in their appointed places, dreaming their century-long dreams of hunger and return. For now, they rested. But the earth was patient, and the dead had all the time in the world. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened to Kevin. Thomas Carr had learned to trust the wrongness long before he understood what it meant. It started as a child, the way certain rooms felt like they were holding their breath, or how some stretches of woods seemed to watch him with an attention that had nothing to do with animals. His mother called it sensitivity. His father called it nonsense. By the time Thomas became a ranger at Olympic National Park in 2009, he'd simply called it the way things were. Some people could identify birds by their songs. Thomas could identify places that didn't want him there. On the morning of October 23, 2011, the Ho rainforest was screaming at him to leave. Not literally. Thomas had never heard voices or seen ghosts. Nothing so clean as that. What he felt was more like a frequency wrong enough to make his teeth ache, a pressure behind his eyes that intensified the deeper he drove his truck down the access road. The Douglas firs towered 300 feet overhead, their trunks wrapped in moss so thick it looked like green fur. Everything in the Ho grew with an intensity that bordered on aggression. The big leaf maples draped in ferns, the fallen logs exploding with mushrooms and seedlings, the very air thick with spores and moisture. It was a rainforest, one of the last temperate ones in North America, and it devoured sunlight like a living thing. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His Garmin eTrex GPS sat in the cup holder, showing his position along the South Fork Ho Road, elevation 578 feet. The device was 3 years old and occasionally lost signal in the deepest parts of the forest, but it was reliable enough. His Motorola XTS 5000 radio crackled with morning check-ins from other rangers. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Except it wasn't. He'd been assigned to investigate an overdue hiker report. Rachel Morrison, 28, solo backpacker from Seattle, had planned a 3-day trek along the Ho River Trail and hadn't checked in with her emergency contact. Her car, a blue Honda Civic, sat in the trailhead parking lot, covered in 4 days' worth of condensation and fallen needles. Thomas had found it 20 minutes ago, and the wrongness had intensified with every step he took toward it. The car was locked. A permit for the backcountry campsite at 5 Mile Island was visible on the dashboard, dated October 19th. Everything suggested a routine hiking trip. Everything except the way Thomas's hands wouldn't stop trembling as he peered through the windows. He radioed in his findings to the ranger station. Unit 7 to base. Vehicle confirmed at Ho Trailhead. Washington plates, David John Mary 7423. Registered to Rachel Morrison. No sign of the hiker. Preparing to start trail search. Static then. Copy that, Unit 7. Weather report shows incoming front this afternoon. Cloud ceiling dropping to 800 feet by 1500 hours. Be advised. Thomas signed off and shouldered his pack. 60 pounds of gear, First aid kit, emergency bivvy, rope, flares, water purification tablets, protein bars, and a folded topographic map marked with Rachel's planned route. He checked his watch, 0847 hours, and started down the trail. The Ho River Trail was one of the park's most popular routes, a relatively easy path that followed the river valley through some of the most spectacular old-growth forest in the world. Thomas had hiked it hundreds of times. He knew every bridge, every campsite, every spot where elk liked to graze. He could navigate it in his sleep, which was why it bothered him when he noticed the trees. They were wrong. Not in any way he could articulate to another person. The Sitka spruces still rose like cathedral columns, their bark hanging in shaggy strips. The western hemlocks still spread their delicate branches in perfect fractal patterns, but something about their arrangement felt deliberate, as if they'd been positioned by something with intentions he couldn't fathom. Thomas had stood beneath these exact trees a month ago during his last patrol. They hadn't felt like this. He forced himself to focus on the task. The trail showed recent boot prints, probably Rachel's given the tread pattern and size. They led steadily east, following the designated path. Thomas moved quickly, scanning the forest floor for any signs of distress or deviation. The morning fog clung to the undergrowth like cobwebs. At mile marker 2.3, he found the first junction point where hikers sometimes took an unofficial social trail down to the river. Thomas checked carefully. No prints left the main trail. Rachel had stayed on course. At mile marker 3.8, the wrongness intensified. Thomas stopped walking. His breath came faster than the easy pace warranted. The pressure behind his eyes had become a steady throb, and his skin felt too tight, as if something invisible were pressing against him from all directions. He'd felt this before once in a section of backcountry where a hiker had died of hypothermia 3 years prior. The forest had felt heavy there, saturated with something that made his lizard brain scream to run. This was worse. He pulled out his GPS. The screen showed his position clearly, approximately 4 miles from the trailhead, elevation 682 feet, following the Ho River Trail toward 5 Mile Island. All correct. The device gave him longitude and latitude, 47.81, 56 degree N, 123.8, 842 degree W. He marked the location and continued. The trail curved around a massive fallen cedar, its trunk wider than Thomas was tall. He'd passed this log countless times, but as he rounded it now, his vision seemed to skip, like a scratched DVD jumping frames. For just a moment, the trail ahead looked different, the trees closer together, their trunks bearing markings he didn't recognize. Thomas blinked hard. The trail resolved back to normal. Getting spooked. He muttered to himself, but his voice sounded wrong in the dense forest air, too flat and muffled. At mile 4.2, he found Rachel's first campsite. The backcountry site at 4 Mile Creek showed clear evidence of use. The fire ring contained cold ashes and partially burned wood. A flat area near the designated tent spot showed compressed vegetation where someone had slept. Thomas examined everything methodically, documenting with his digital camera. A Canon power shot that gave him reasonably clear images despite the dim forest light. The campsite was too clean. Food bags should have been hung from the bare wire. None were present. No trash, no forgotten items. Nothing to indicate a panicked departure. Just the ashes and the flattened ground, as if Rachel had broken camp normally and continued her hike, except her permit said she'd planned to stay 2 nights before moving to 5 Mile Island. Thomas checked his notes. Rachel had started her hike on October 19th. It was now October 23rd, 4 days. If she'd stayed here the first night as planned, she should have moved to 5 Mile Island on the 20th, then hiked out on the 21st. But her car was still at the trailhead, and there'd been no emergency beacon activation, no calls for help. He keyed his radio. Unit 7 to base, located first campsite at 4 Mile Creek. Evidence of use, but no personal items left behind. Continuing to 5 Mile Island. Copy, Unit 7. Be advised we're getting reports of disorientation from hikers in Sector 7 Delta. 3 separate groups reported feeling lost even on marked trails. Might be atmospheric conditions affecting inner ear. Stay alert. Thomas's hand tightened on the radio. Sector 7 Delta was 40 miles north, a completely different watershed. Has this been reported in Ho Valley before? Negative, just started this morning, probably unrelated, but stay sharp. Copy that. He continued hiking, but now the wrongness had a shape to it, a direction. It wasn't coming from ahead or behind, it was coming from the forest itself, from the spaces between the trees, from the too green moss and the shadows that fell at angles that didn't quite match the filtered sunlight. The Ho River rushed alongside the trail, its water the color of glacial silt, gray-green and opaque. Thomas had swum in this river during summer patrols, knew its temperature never rose above 50 degrees even in August. Now it seemed louder than usual, a white noise that made it hard to think clearly. 5 Mile Island sat in a wide bend of the river, accessible by a footbridge that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The designated campsite was popular, equipped with proper bear wires and a good view of the water. Thomas approached carefully, already knowing what he'd find. Another abandoned campsite. Same pattern. Ashes in the fire ring, compressed ground, no gear, no trash, nothing. But this time there were tracks leaving the site. Thomas knelt beside them, his knees sinking into soft duff. Boot prints, definitely Rachel's, based on the tread pattern. They led away from the campsite, not toward the trail back to the parking lot, but north into the unmarked forest. No hiker would do that. The Ho rainforest off-trail was a nightmare of deadfall, devil's club thorns, and impassable thickets. You could travel maybe a quarter mile in an hour if you were lucky, and you'd emerge covered in scratches and exhausted. There was no reason to leave the trail, especially not for an experienced hiker like Rachel, whose emergency contact had described her as cautious and well-prepared. Unless she wasn't thinking clearly anymore, unless something had made her want to go deeper. Thomas stood slowly, following the track line with his eyes. The boot prints led straight into a section of forest where the trees grew so densely that the understory was almost black. He pulled out his compass and took a bearing. 342 degrees, roughly north-northwest. He should call this in. Protocol dictated that he mark the location, return to base, and come back with a search team. But the wrongness was pulling at him now, a hook in his chest drawing him toward those trees. His sensitivity had never been this strong before, never so insistent. It felt like the forest was trying to tell him something, or warn him, or... Thomas stopped that line of thinking. He'd learned early that trying to rationalize the feelings only made them worse. Better to acknowledge them and move forward with caution. He radioed in his position and findings, then followed Rachel's trail into the unmarked forest. The change was immediate and total. The moment Thomas stepped off the established trail, the quality of sound altered. The river's rush faded to a distant murmur, despite being less than 50 yards away. The forest canopy seemed to lower, pressing down like a hand on his skull. His breath came in short gasps that had nothing to do with exertion. Rachel's tracks led through the undergrowth with an unnatural directness, as if she'd walked through spaces that shouldn't have been navigable. Thomas pushed through a wall of sword ferns and found himself in a small clearing where the moss grew thick as carpet. The tracks continued straight across, not wavering, not pausing. He marked his position on the GPS, 47.8198 degree N, 123.890 W. The device showed he'd traveled roughly 500 feet from 5 Mile Island. He took a photo of the tracks for documentation, though the clearing itself looked strange through the camera viewfinder. The moss too uniformly green, the light filtering down in shafts that seemed wrong somehow. Too straight, too focused. Thomas continued. The tracks led him through a maze of fallen logs and under low-hanging branches that seemed positioned to catch at his pack. He had to climb over a nurse log so massive it formed a wall 12 feet high, its surface erupting with hemlock saplings. On the far side, Rachel's prints reappeared, still heading north-northwest with that same unsettling directness. His watch showed 10:34 hours. He'd been following the off-trail tracks for nearly 30 minutes and couldn't have traveled more than a quarter mile. At this rate, if Rachel had been walking continuously, she could be miles deep into the forest by now. The thought sent a spike of anxiety through his chest. Nobody survived long in these conditions. The temperature at night dropped into the 30s. Hypothermia could set in within hours if you were wet and couldn't build a fire, but Rachel's track showed no signs of distress or confusion. No circling back, no hesitation. Just forward, forward, always forward. Thomas pushed through another wall of vegetation and stopped. The trees ahead were wrong in a way he could finally articulate. They formed a pattern. Not a natural pattern of random growth and competition for sunlight, but an arrangement. 7 Douglas firs, each roughly 4 feet in diameter, standing in a circle approximately 40 feet across. Their lowest branches began at 30 feet up, creating a cathedral-like space beneath them. The ground inside the circle was bare of undergrowth. No ferns, no moss, just dark earth marked with Rachel's boot prints leading to the center. Thomas's hands shook as he raised his camera. Through the viewfinder, the circle of trees looked even more deliberate, their trunks perfectly spaced, their bark bearing marks that might have been natural scarring or might have been something else. He took 3 photos, each click of the shutter absurdly loud in the silent clearing. The wrongness was so strong now that his vision blurred at the edges. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to back away, to return to the trail, to get out of this forest before something noticed him. But Rachel's tracks led into the circle. Thomas entered. The pressure in his head spiked so sharply he gasped and dropped to one knee. His ears popped as if he'd changed elevation suddenly, though the GPS showed he'd gained less than 20 feet since leaving 5 Mile Island. The air tasted different here, heavier, older, saturated with something organic that coated his tongue. At the center of the circle, Rachel's track stopped. Just stopped. No final print indicating she'd turned around. No signs of a struggle or collapse. The boot prints simply ended in the middle of the bare earth circle, as if she'd been plucked from the ground mid-stride. Thomas stood slowly, turning in a full circle. 7 trees, perfectly spaced. No Rachel, no gear, no indication of where she'd gone. His radio crackled. Unit 7, this is base. Do you copy? He grabbed for the radio with trembling hands. Base, this is Unit 7. I copy. Weather front moving in faster than predicted. We're pulling all rangers from backcountry. What's your current position? Thomas looked at his GPS. The screen showed static. He shook the device. Nothing. He tried turning it off and back on. The screen remained a scrambled mess of pixels. Unit 7, do you copy? We need your position. GPS is malfunctioning. I'm approximately... Thomas pulled out his topographic map and tried to estimate based on his last known position. I'm roughly 1 mile north of 5 Mile Island, unmarked forest. Following missing hiker tracks. Found evidence of... Static drowned out his words. Unit 7, breaking. Return to immediately. More static, then silence. Thomas tried different channels. Nothing. The radio was dead, or the weather front was interfering with transmission, or something else was happening that he didn't want to consider. He checked his watch. 10:47 hours. Checked his compass, still pointing north. Checked his surroundings. 7 trees in a perfect circle. Rachel's tracks ending at the center. Thomas turned to leave and realized he couldn't remember which direction he'd entered from. The circle looked the same in every direction. Same 7 trees, same spacing, same bare earth. He'd entered from the south, he was certain of it, following Rachel's tracks. But when he looked at the ground, he couldn't find his own boot prints leading back out. Panic, real and metallic, flooded his mouth. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Panic killed people in the backcountry faster than exposure. He had a compass. He had a map. He'd entered from the south, so he needed to exit south, follow his own disturbed vegetation trail back to 5 Mile Island. Thomas walked to the southern edge of the circle and pushed through the ring of trees. He stepped into another circle of 7 trees, identical to the first. Same diameter, same bare earth, same silent cathedral space. Rachel's boot prints led to the center and stopped. Thomas spun around, his breathing ragged. He'd just walked through those trees. He should be outside the circle in the dense forest. Instead, he was in an identical circle. This isn't happening, he said aloud. His voice fell dead in the heavy air, not even an echo. He tried again, walking east this time, through the trees into another circle, west, another circle, north, another circle. Thomas stood in the center of what might have been the same circle or might have been one of 5 identical circles, his mind fracturing around the impossibility of it. The forest didn't work this way. Forests were ecosystems, organic and chaotic. They didn't create perfect geometric patterns. They didn't trap people in recursive spaces. He was having a breakdown. That was the only explanation. The stress of the job, the accumulated weight of all those years of feeling wrongness he couldn't explain, had finally cracked something in his brain. He was lying on the trail somewhere, unconscious, maybe having a seizure or a stroke, and this was just his dying mind's attempt to make sense of failing neurons. Except he could feel the cold, damp air on his skin, could smell the rich decay of the forest floor, could see the perfect detail of the bark on those 7 trees, each crack and fissure and patch of lichen rendered in crystalline clarity. This was real. Somehow, impossibly, this was real. Thomas sat down hard on the bare earth, his pack thudding against his back. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He needed to think, needed to figure this out. But his thoughts kept sliding away like water on glass. How long had Rachel been trapped here? Had she walked in circles until exhaustion or hypothermia took her? Was her body lying somewhere just beyond his limited field of vision, hidden by the same spatial impossibility that trapped him? A sound cut through the silence, a single crack, like a branch breaking under weight. Thomas's head snapped up. One of the 7 trees had a mark on it he hadn't noticed before. Not a natural scar, a carving, fresh enough that sap still beaded along the cuts, forming symbols that looked almost like letters but weren't quite. 3 of them, arranged vertically down the trunk at chest height. He approached slowly, as if the tree might notice and react. The symbols had been carved with something sharp and precise, a knife maybe, or an axe. The top symbol looked like an angular eye. The middle one resembled a hand with too many fingers. The bottom one was just a horizontal line with 3 vertical marks crossing it. Thomas had never seen anything like them. They weren't Native American petroglyphs. He'd studied those extensively during his training. They weren't modern graffiti or trail markers. They were something else. Something that made the wrongness spike so hard his knees buckled. Behind him, another crack. He turned. A different tree now bore the same 3 symbols, carved at the exact same height, still weeping sap. Thomas backed toward the center of the circle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't heard anyone approach. He hadn't seen anyone. But someone, something, was carving symbols into the trees while he watched. A 3rd tree marked itself. Then a 4th. Thomas spun, watching as the symbols appeared on each of the 7 trees in turn, carved by invisible hands with audible precision. The sound echoed in the silent clearing. Crack, 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 like bones breaking. When the 7th tree bore its marks, the silence returned, heavier than before. Then the trees moved, not swaying in wind. There was no wind. They moved deliberately, their trunks shifting position, roots tearing through earth with sounds like fabric ripping. The circle contracted, the trees drawing closer together, closing the gaps between them. Thomas scrambled backward, watching in horror as the 7 trees rearranged themselves into a tighter formation. Where there had been 40 feet of open space, now there was 30, then 20. The bare earth beneath his feet felt suddenly unstable, as if it might open and swallow him. He could smell something now, organic and old, like autumn leaves left to rot for decades. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath misting in the air. 15 feet. The trees groaned as they moved, their bark grinding against itself with sounds that shouldn't come from wood. The symbols on their trunks began to glow with a faint phosphorescence, the same sickly green as bioluminescent fungi. 10 feet. Thomas pulled his radio from his belt and keyed the transmit button desperately. "Base, this is Unit 7. Emergency. I need immediate assistance at..." Static swallowed his words. But through the static, he heard something else. A voice. or many voices, speaking in harmonics that made his teeth ache. They weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language he recognized. The sounds were too old, too laden with breath that wasn't quite breath. 5 feet. The circle of trees enclosed him now, their lowest branches overhead, their trunks so close he could reach out and touch them. The glowing cymbals pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The voices from the radio grew louder, more insistent, and Thomas realized with creeping horror that they weren't coming from the radio at all. They were coming from the trees themselves, from the spaces between the bark, from the roots digging through soil beneath his feet. He dropped the radio and pulled out his knife. A foolish gesture, bringing a blade against trees that moved. But holding it made him feel slightly less helpless as the circle contracted to its final configuration. The 7 trees stood so close now that their branches interlocked overhead, blotting out what little light filtered through the canopy. In the green glowing darkness, Thomas saw things moving in the bark, patterns shifting and flowing, faces forming and dissolving, hands reaching out from impossible dimensions. Then the voices unified into something he could almost understand. Leshi ne puskayet, leshi ne zabiet, leshi zabirayot. Not English. Russian, maybe, or something older that Russian descended from. Thomas's mind scrambled to parse the sounds, to find meaning in the archaic syllables. The Forest Lord does not permit. The Forest Lord does not forget. The Forest Lord takes. The trees opened. Not physically. They didn't move apart. Instead, the space between them split, reality tearing along invisible seams to reveal what lay beneath the visible forest. Thomas saw another version of the same space, the circle, the bare earth, but populated with figures. Hikers. Dozens of them, maybe more. They stood motionless in the cathedral space, their eyes open but unseeing, their bodies covered in moss and lichen as if they'd been standing there for years. Some wore modern clothing, Gore-Tex jackets and hiking boots. Others wore older gear, canvas packs and wool sweaters. One figure near the edge wore what looked like 1970s-era equipment, his body so colonized by plant growth that ferns sprouted from his shoulders. Rachel Morrison stood among them, her eyes open, her mouth slightly parted, moss already beginning to climb her left boot. Thomas tried to scream, but his throat had closed. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The wrongness that had been building all day had reached critical mass, pinning him in place with weight he couldn't fight. The voices spoke again, and this time he understood them completely. You were warned. You felt us pushing you away. You felt the forest telling you to leave. But you came deeper. You always come deeper. And when you come, we keep you. We keep you because you forget that these places are ours, that they were ours before your trails and your markers, that they will be ours long after your civilization crumbles. We are the Leshy, the guardians of the old growth, and we do not permit trespass. Thomas's vision dimmed at the edges. He felt something like roots burrowing into the soles of his boots, felt his muscles beginning to lock, felt moss starting to grow in the creases of his jacket. His last conscious thought was of his mother, telling him as a child that his sensitivity was a gift. She'd been wrong. It was a mark, a way for the forest to identify those who could sense its presence, who posed the greatest threat to its sovereignty. The Leshy didn't take random hikers. It took those who could perceive it, who might eventually tell others that something ancient still lived in these trees. His eyes fixed in their sockets, his breath slowed to 1 cycle per minute, then 1 per hour. The moss grew. The 7 trees moved apart, returning to their original positions, leaving Thomas standing with the others in a space that existed slightly outside normal reality. The symbols on the trunks faded. The circle became just another patch of old-growth forest, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. Incident report, October 25, 2011. Olympic National Park, Search and Rescue Division Ranger Thomas Carr, employee Narmy 4427, failed to return from solo patrol of Ho River Trail on October 23, 2011. Last radio contact at 10:47 hours reported GPS malfunction and investigation of missing hiker Rachel Morrison. Full SAR deployment initiated October 24th. Search teams located Carr's vehicle at Ho Trailhead and Rachel Morrison's vehicle in adjacent parking space. Trail search revealed both hikers' boot prints along established trail to 5 Mile Island backcountry campsite. Prints continue into unmarked forest heading north-northwest. Ground and air search of surrounding area over 48 hours yielded no evidence of either missing person. No camping gear, no emergency signals, no physical evidence discovered. Search called off October 26th due to dangerous weather conditions. Ranger Carr and civilian Morrison officially listed as missing lost in Olympic National Forest. File remains open pending further evidence. Administrative note: this marks the 7th disappearance in Ho Valley sector since 1967. All cases share common elements: experienced hikers, equipment abandoned, tracks leading into unmarked forest, no physical evidence of distress. Pattern noted, but no causal mechanism identified. Recommendation: consider closing Ho River Trail 5 Mile Island camping zone pending further investigation. Status: recommendation under review. Supplemental report, November 3, 2011. Ranger Jennifer Hawks reported spatial disorientation during routine patrol of 5 Mile Island area. Hawks describes feeling watched and experiencing difficulty maintaining directional sense despite clear trail markers. GPS unit malfunctioned during patrol. Hawks able to return to trailhead but requested reassignment. Similar reports from 3 other rangers conducting searches in same area. All rangers describe unusual atmospheric conditions and equipment failures. All report feeling pushed away from certain sections of forest north of 5 Mile Island. Medical evaluations show no physical abnormalities. Psychological evaluations inconclusive. Recommendation: implement buddy system for all patrols in Ho Valley sector. Consider permanent closure of unmarked forest areas. Status: under review. From the desk of Park Superintendent Margaret Chen, November 15, 2011. I've reviewed the incident reports regarding the Carr-Morrison disappearances and subsequent ranger experiences in the Ho Valley sector. While I sympathize with the rangers' distress, I cannot justify closing one of our most popular trails based on feelings of being watched or GPS malfunctions. Equipment failures happen. People get disoriented in dense forest. These are unfortunate facts of wilderness management, not evidence of anything supernatural. The buddy system implementation is approved. All rangers will patrol in pairs until further notice. However, the Ho River Trail will remain open to the public. Thomas Carr was an excellent ranger and Rachel Morrison was an experienced hiker. Their loss is tragic, but people have been disappearing in forests since humans first started walking into them. It's the nature of wilderness. It's why we have warning signs. We'll continue standard SAR protocols, but I won't spread panic based on coincidence and superstition. File closed pending new evidence. In the old growth forest, where trees grow for 1,000 years and the moss swallows sound, 7 Douglas firs stand in a circle that tourists occasionally photograph, thinking it's a natural oddity. The rangers who patrol this section now report nothing unusual, having learned quickly not to mention the pressure behind their eyes or the way their skin crawls when they pass too close. The circle keeps its collection in a space slightly adjacent to the visible world. Thomas Carr stands among them, his eyes open but unseeing, his body slowly becoming part of the forest floor. Moss climbs his uniform. Ferns sprout from his boots. In another decade, he'll be unrecognizable as human, just another feature of the landscape, another warning unheeded. The Leshy is patient. The Leshy is eternal. And the Leshy does not forget that these forests were its domain long before humans gave them names and drew them on maps. Every few years, someone sensitive enough to feel its presence ventures too deep, and the collection grows. The warnings are always the same. Wrongness that builds with each step. Pressure that increases with proximity. A certainty in the gut that says, turn back, turn back, turn back. Some people listen, most don't. The forest keeps those who don't listen. The forest always keeps them. The end. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Thomas and Rachel. Christopher Hayes had never believed in patterns that couldn't be explained by mathematics. That's what made the spreadsheet on his laptop screen so profoundly wrong. He sat in the cramped ranger station office at Cades Cove, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, watching rain streak the windows as October darkness gathered early. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular institutional pallor that made the wood paneling look jaundiced. His Garmin E-Trex GPS lay beside his keyboard, still displaying coordinates from yesterday's trail survey. The coffee in his NPS-issued mug had gone cold hours ago, but Christopher hadn't noticed. His eyes were fixed on the numbers that refused to make sense. 7 disappearances. Same 3-mile stretch of the Turkey Pin Ridge Trail. Always women between 23 and 27 years old. Always in October. Always in years ending in 9. 1929, 1939, 1949, 1959, 1969, 1979, 1989. The intervals were perfect. 20 years apart, almost to the day. The last one had been Sarah Garrett in 1989, 20 years ago this month. Christopher had spent 6 years as a data analyst for the Census Bureau before burning out and accepting this transfer to the National Park Service. He'd thought it would be simpler: track wildlife, monitor trail conditions, file reports, numbers that behaved themselves. But his supervisor had asked him to digitize old missing persons records, and Christopher couldn't help running queries, looking for patterns. It's what his brain did automatically, the same way some people couldn't help humming songs or correcting grammar. The pattern he'd found made his stomach feel hollow. He clicked through the scanned case files again. Margaret Dalka, 1929, Romanian immigrant, 24 years old, last seen heading toward the old Caldwell homestead ruins. Anna Popescu, 1939, another Romanian name, 23, disappeared near the same location. The surnames changed, but the ethnic markers persisted through several cases. By 1969, they were Americanized names: Jennifer Walsh, Katie Morrison. But the ages stayed within that narrow band. The location never varied by more than half a mile, and always October, always years ending in 9. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally was effectively 0. Christopher had run the numbers 3 times, adjusting for population density, trail traffic patterns, seasonal variation. Nothing explained it. It was like finding a mathematical formula embedded in random noise, except random noise didn't organize itself into 20-year cycles. His Motorola radio crackled. "Hayes, you still there? Over." Christopher reached for it. "Yeah, Tom. Just finishing up some data entry. Storm's getting worse. Road down to Cades Cove might wash out. You should head home. Over." "Copy that. Leaving soon. Over." He set the radio down and stared at the screen again. Today was October 19th, 2009. If the pattern held, and Christopher's rational mind insisted patterns didn't just hold without causation, someone should already be missing. A woman, early 20s, somewhere on Turkey Pin Ridge. The thought was absurd. He was giving significance to coincidence, seeing intention in random data. That's what humans did. Found faces in clouds, heard voices in white noise, constructed meaning from chaos, because the alternative was admitting the universe didn't care about narrative coherence. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister. "Did you remember Mom's birthday is next week?" Christopher rubbed his eyes. He'd forgotten. Again, that's what happened when you spent 12-hour days staring at spreadsheets. Your brain started treating everything like data points instead of actual human experiences. Maybe that's why the pattern bothered him so much. 7 women weren't numbers in a sequence. They'd been people with sisters who texted them, mothers with birthdays, lives that had ended on the same stretch of mountain trail across 80 years. He saved his work and was reaching for his jacket when his supervisor's office door opened. Tom Breslin emerged, phone pressed to his ear, his weathered face carved with new lines of concern. He was 63, built like a fire hydrant, with a particular variety of competence that came from 40 years of dealing with lost hikers, black bear encounters, and the occasional marijuana grow operation in the backcountry. Tom hung up and looked at Christopher. "We've got a missing hiker. Woman called in by her boyfriend. She was supposed to meet him at the Cades Cove picnic area 2 hours ago. Never showed." The hollow feeling in Christopher's stomach expanded. Where was she hiking? Turkey Pen Ridge Trail. Christopher's hand stopped halfway to his jacket. What's her age? Tom consulted his notepad. 26? Megan Thornwood. Why? What's today's date? October 19th. Christopher, what year? Tom's expression shifted from confused to concerned. 2009. Are you feeling okay? Christopher turned his laptop screen toward Tom. I found a pattern in the old missing persons files. 7 women. Same trail, same age range. Always October of years ending in 9. 20-year intervals. The last one was 1989. Tom walked over slowly, reading glasses emerging from his shirt pocket. He studied the spreadsheet in silence. The rain intensified against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door creaked in the wind. Jesus, Tom finally said. I've been here since '82. I remember the Sarah Garrett case in '89. Search went on for 2 weeks. Never found a trace. He looked up at Christopher. But this has to be coincidence. You're saying what? Some kind of serial killer working on a 20-year schedule? I'm not saying anything, I'm showing you numbers. Numbers can lie, especially when you torture them enough. I didn't torture these. I just asked a simple query. Unsolved disappearances by location. This is what came back. Tom stared at the screen, his jaw working. Then he shook his head. We've got a missing hiker right now. That's real. That takes priority. You want to help with the search? Christopher grabbed his jacket. Which trailhead did she start from? Boyfriend says she took the Turkey Pen Ridge access from the old Caldwell Cemetery. Planned a 4-hour loop, should have been back by 2. It's almost 7 now. The Caldwell Cemetery. Christopher pulled up his case files. Margaret Dalka, 1929. Last seen heading toward old Caldwell homestead ruins near Family Cemetery. Anna Popescu, 1939. Disappeared while photographing abandoned cemetery stones. I'm coming, Christopher said. They took Tom's F-150 up the winding gravel road toward the trailhead, windshield wipers fighting the downpour. The headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating sheets of rain and the close pressing walls of forest. This part of the park had been settled in the 1850s, before the government bought out the families and created the national park in 1934. Old homesteads still dotted the mountains, collapsed cabins, stone foundations, family plots with headstones going back to the Civil War. Tell me about the Romanian connection, Christopher said. Tom glanced at him. What Romanian connection? The first 2 victims in 1929 and 39, Romanian surnames. I looked it up. There was a Romanian immigrant community that worked the copper mines near here in the early 1900s. Before my time, but yeah, there's a Romanian Orthodox cemetery up past Caldwell. Small one, maybe 20 plots. Haven't been maintained in decades. Any local legends associated with it? Tom's hands tightened on the steering wheel. You're really buying into this pattern thing, aren't you? I'm keeping an open mind about statistical anomalies. There's stories, Tom admitted, but every old cemetery has stories. People see lights, hear voices. Teenagers spook themselves. It's just atmosphere. What kind of stories? The old-timers used to talk about the Dalka family. Father and 2 sons worked the mines until there was a collapse in 1927. All 3 died. The mother, Margaret Dalka, your 1929 disappearance, she was supposedly unhinged with grief. The locals claimed she was practicing some kind of, I don't know, old country superstition, trying to bring them back. Christopher felt something cold move through his chest, but he kept his voice level. What kind of superstition? I don't know the details. This is third-hand folklore from 80 years ago. But after Margaret disappeared, people said they'd see lights in the cemetery at night, see figures that looked like the Dalka men, but wrong somehow, moving strangely. That kind of bullshit. Strigoi, Christopher said quietly. What? Romanian folklore. Undead that return from the grave. Different from vampires, more like revenant spirits in corpse form. They can walk in daylight, appear almost human. But they have compulsions. They return to specific places, to people they knew in life. Often they're created through improper burial or when someone dies in a state of sin or terrible grief. Tom pulled into the muddy parking area near the trailhead. Through the rain, Christopher could see one other vehicle. A blue Honda Civic with a Maryville College parking sticker. Megan's car. "How the hell do you know Romanian folklore?" Tom asked. "I looked it up when I saw the surnames. Wanted to understand the cultural context." Christopher climbed out into the rain, pulling on his Gore-Tex jacket. The temperature had dropped into the 40s, and the wind carried the smell of wet leaves and decay. If Margaret Dalka was trying to resurrect her family using Strigoi rituals, then you've been reading too many horror novels, Tom interrupted. "Come on, we need to find this girl." They geared up quickly. Flashlights, first aid kit, radio, GPS. Christopher programmed the Garmin with the coordinates of the Romanian cemetery and the Caldwell homestead ruins. 2 miles up the trail through increasingly rough terrain. The storm made everything harder. The trail would be slick, visibility near zero. Tom radioed in their position and they started hiking. The trail climbed steeply through second-growth forest, oak, hickory, tulip poplar. In the daylight, this would be beautiful country. In the storm dark, with rain hammering through the canopy and their flashlight beams barely penetrating 10 feet, it felt like walking through a tunnel that might collapse at any moment. Christopher's mind kept working the problem. If the disappearances were murders, the perpetrator would be impossibly old, either a 100-plus-year-old serial killer or multiple killers working to the same pattern. Both scenarios were absurd. If they were accidents, the statistical clustering was unexplainable. Random chance didn't produce 20-year cycles, unless it wasn't random, unless something about this place, this date, created conditions that made disappearances more likely, some kind of environmental factor that occurred cyclically. But what environmental factor operated on a 20-year schedule and targeted women of a specific age? His flashlight caught something pale ahead. A sign, Caldwell Family Cemetery. An arrow pointing left off the main trail. Megan's boyfriend said she wanted to photograph old headstones, Tom said. She was doing some kind of art project about Appalachian history. They turned onto the narrower path. The forest closed in tighter here, and Christopher noticed the trees looked different, older, more gnarled. A few had cloth scraps tied to branches, weathered and torn. Offerings maybe, though to what he couldn't guess. The cemetery appeared suddenly, a cleared space of perhaps 30 yards across. The headstones leaned at angles, many cracked or fallen. A rusted iron fence surrounded the perimeter, sections collapsed into the undergrowth. Christopher counted approximately 40 graves, most dating from the 1850s through 1920s. And sitting in the center, beneath a dripping oak tree, was a backpack. Tom got to it first, pulling a wallet from the front pocket. Megan Thornwood, North Carolina driver's license. He looked around, raising his voice. "Megan, can you hear me?" Nothing but rain and wind. Christopher swept his flashlight across the cemetery. The names on the legible stones were familiar from census records: Caldwell, Morrison, Garrett, and in the far corner, 5 stones in a tight cluster. He walked over, his boots sinking into mud. The Dalka family plot. The father and 2 sons died 1927. And beside them, a 4th stone, Margaret Dalka, 1902. The death date was blank. A 5th stone stood slightly apart, smaller, weathered almost smooth. Christopher knelt and traced the faint letters. AC Doarme cel ce nu poate muri. His Romanian was rusty, but he parsed it. Here sleeps that which cannot die. "Tom," he called, "come look at this." But when he turned, Tom wasn't visible. The flashlight beam showed the cemetery, the iron fence, the leaning stones. No Tom. Tom? A shape moved between 2 obelisks. Christopher's flashlight caught it. A man's figure, too far away to make out details. But the movement was wrong. The gait was stiff, mechanical, like someone trying to remember how legs worked. "Tom, is that you?" The figure stopped, turned toward him. The flashlight beam couldn't reach its face, but Christopher felt his nervous system flood with something that wasn't quite fear yet. A pre-fear, an animal recognition that he was being evaluated by something that saw him as prey. Then Tom's voice came from behind him. "Christopher, where'd you go?" Christopher spun. Tom was emerging from the trees on the opposite side of the cemetery, flashlight sweeping. When Christopher looked back toward the figure, it was gone. "Did you see someone?" Christopher asked. "See who?" "Christopher, we need to stay together. This is search and rescue basics." There was someone, between those two tall headstones. Tom walked over, shining his light. Nobody here. Maybe it was a deer. Rain plays tricks with shadows. But Christopher's hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. The figure had been human-shaped, human-sized, and it had moved with that awful puppeted quality, like something wearing a person instead of being one. They searched the cemetery thoroughly, calling Megan's name. Tom found a digital camera in her backpack, a Nikon D60, nice equipment. He checked the last photos, headstones, atmospheric shots of fog through trees, close-ups of carved death's heads and weeping willows. The final photo was time-stamped 3:47 p.m. It showed the Romanian cemetery plot, and standing in the background just out of focus was a figure. Tom zoomed in, but the resolution dissolved into pixels. Could have been a person, could have been a shadow, could have been digital artifacting. "We need more people," Tom said. "This isn't a two-person search anymore, I'm calling in a full team." But when he tried his radio, nothing happened. He checked the battery, full. Frequency, correct. He could hear static, but no response when he transmitted. Christopher pulled out his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising in the mountains. But his phone's screen was glitching, pixels scrambling and reforming. "Equipment failure," Tom said. "The storm must be causing interference." "Both our radios and my phone simultaneously?" "It happens." But Tom's voice carried no conviction. Christopher could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The same calculation Christopher himself was running. The odds of multiple independent systems failing at the exact same moment in this specific location while they searched for a woman who fit an 80-year pattern. Lightning flashed, and in that blue-white instant, Christopher saw the figure again. Closer now, maybe 20 yards away, standing at the cemetery's edge. It was male, dressed in clothing that looked wrong. Not historically wrong, just fundamentally mismatched, like someone had found random garments and put them on without understanding their purpose. The face was in shadow, but Christopher registered sunken cheeks, deep-set eyes that didn't blink in the rain. Thunder followed, and the darkness returned. When Tom's flashlight swept that direction, nothing was there. "We need to leave," Christopher said. "Now. We have a missing hiker. We're being hunted." Tom stared at him. "Christopher, you're letting pattern recognition override reality. You found a coincidental data cluster, and now you're seeing threats that don't exist. Explain the figure. Shadow, tree, deer, any of 100 rational explanations." But Tom was already backing toward the trail, his hand on the bear spray canister at his belt. Whatever he claimed to believe, his body knew predator behavior when it encountered it. They reached the main trail and started down, moving faster than was safe on the slick mud. Christopher kept his flashlight aimed behind them. Twice he thought he saw movement in the trees. The wind had shifted, and it carried a smell that hadn't been there before, something like spoiled meat and damp earth. "The Garmin," Christopher said, pulling out the GPS unit. The screen showed their location but was flickering erratically. "It's having the same issues." "Later, just move." They were perhaps half a mile from the trailhead when Christopher heard it, a sound from the forest to their left. Not an animal sound, not wind, something closer to breathing, but wet and ragged, like lungs that had forgotten how to process air properly. Tom heard it too. His flashlight snapped toward the sound. 3 figures stood between the trees. All male, all with that same awkward posture and wrong clothing. Their faces were visible now, and Christopher's mind tried to reject what he was seeing. The flesh was gray-tinged, sunken in places but still functional. Eyes tracked their movement, mouths hung slack, revealing dark interiors. The center figure took a step forward. His gait had that mechanical quality Christopher had noticed before, but there was intelligence behind it. The eyes were watching, calculating. The mouth moved, producing a sound that might have been words in a language Christopher didn't recognize. Tom raised his radio like a weapon, though what good that would do, Christopher couldn't imagine. "Stay back! We're federal law enforcement officers." The figures paused. Then the center one smiled, an expression so profoundly wrong that Christopher felt his gorge rise. It wasn't a human smile. It was something performing an approximate recreation based on corrupted memories. "Tom," Christopher said quietly, "Romanian folklore says Strigoi are repelled by..." The figure moved, not fast by human standards, but with an unnaturalness that made it seem faster than it was, like frames had been cut from a film. It covered half the distance between them in a motion that Christopher's eyes couldn't quite parse. Tom discharged the bear spray. The stream hit the figure directly in the face. It stopped, reached up and wiped the spray away as casually as someone clearing rainwater. The eyes never left them. They ran. The trail was treacherous, all mud and exposed roots, but terror overrode caution. Christopher's flashlight beam bounced wildly. He could hear Tom behind him, breath coming in gasps, and something else behind Tom, that wet, labored breathing, and footsteps that didn't fall at human intervals. A tree root caught Christopher's boot and he went down hard, flashlight flying from his grip. He rolled, mud caking his clothes, and saw the figures emerging from the forest. 5 of them now. 6. They moved with increasing confidence, as if remembering how pursuit worked. Their mouths hung open, and that breathing sound filled the forest, a choir of dead lungs forcing air through throats that should no longer function. Tom hauled him up. "Go!" They burst out of the tree line into the parking area. Megan's Honda sat abandoned, Christopher's truck beside it. Tom fumbled for his keys, dropping them once in his panic. The figures emerged from the trail, walking now, not hurrying. They knew escape was unlikely. Tom got the truck started. Christopher dove into the passenger seat and slammed the door as the nearest figure reached the vehicle. It placed both hands on Christopher's window and leaned close, face pressing against the glass. The features were male, possibly mid-30s when death had occurred. The skin had a waxy quality, yellow-gray where it stretched over bone. But the eyes were active, fully aware, examining Christopher with what might have been curiosity. The mouth opened, and a sound emerged. Words in Romanian, Christopher thought, but distorted, slurred. Tom floored it. The truck fishtailed in the mud, then found traction. The figure fell away. In the side mirror, Christopher watched them standing in the rain, watching the truck retreat. One raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture that felt like acknowledgement, like recognition. They made it back to the ranger station in silence. Tom drove white-knuckled, checking the mirrors constantly. Christopher's mind was trying to construct a rational framework and failing. He'd seen what he'd seen. Equipment failures. Figures that moved wrong. Faces that should be dead. The station was empty this late. Tom locked the doors, then locked them again, checking each window. He poured 2 mugs of coffee from the perpetual pot, both hands shaking. "What?" he said and stopped. Started again. "What did we just see?" "I don't know." "Your folklore research, Strigoi. What are they?" Christopher pulled up his files, grateful for the familiar structure of documented research. According to Romanian tradition, Strigoi are souls of the dead who cannot rest, usually created when someone dies in a state of sin or terrible emotional anguish, or without proper burial rites. They're bound to specific locations, to people they knew in life. They can appear almost human, but their movements are wrong. They don't need to breathe normally, and they have no fear of conventional weapons. How do you kill them? Traditional methods are staking through the heart, cutting off the head, burning the body. But sources disagree on effectiveness. Because the Strigoi isn't technically alive. It's more like an animation, a puppet controlled by the unquiet soul. Tom drank his coffee in one long swallow. Margaret Dalka, 1929. She died trying to bring her family back. The cemetery, that's ground zero. And every 20 years, someone disappears there. Not disappears, Christopher said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. Gets taken. Megan's still there, Tom. Somewhere in those woods, but not alive. Then we call in state police, FBI, get a full search. And tell them what? That we were chased by the walking dead? They'll think we're delusional. And anyone who goes into those woods tonight will end up like Megan. So we just leave her? Christopher pulled up his research. According to the sources, Strigoi feed on human energy. Life force, some texts call it. They need it to maintain their animation. The ritual Margaret performed probably created them, bound them to that location. But they need periodic replenishment. That's the 20-year cycle. Some kind of supernatural metabolism. That's insane. Yes, but it explains the pattern. It explains the statistical impossibility. It explains what we saw. Christopher met Tom's eyes. You know what we saw. Your rational mind might be fighting it, but your hindbrain knows. Those things are real and they have Megan. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "What do we do?" Christopher thought about the mathematical certainty of the pattern. 7 disappearances across 80 years. Statistical significance that couldn't be denied. And now, Megan made 8. If he'd found the data sooner, if he'd recognized the pattern last week instead of today, could he have prevented this? We document everything, he said. We create a record that can't be ignored. Photos, GPS coordinates, our testimony, and we warn people. Make sure no one else goes up there, especially not in October of 2029. You're talking about accepting this, living with it. I'm talking about acknowledging reality, even when reality violates every assumption we've built our worldview on. Christopher saved his research files to 3 separate flash drives. There are things in this world that don't fit our models, things that operate by rules we don't understand. Our job now is to make sure others don't pay the price for our ignorance. Tom started to respond, then froze. Both men heard it simultaneously. Footsteps on the station's wooden porch, slow, deliberate steps that stopped directly outside the door. The door handle turned. Christopher had watched Tom lock it. The deadbolt was engaged, but the handle turned anyway, metal grinding against metal in a way that made his teeth ache. Tom grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Station 5. We have an intruder." The radio squealed with feedback that resolved into voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, speaking in Romanian, and under them, a sound like wind through a graveyard, or lungs that no longer remembered proper function. The door opened. The lock held, but the door opened anyway, wood bending and splitting around the frame. A figure stood on the threshold, the same one who had pressed its face to the truck window. It studied them both with those awful, aware eyes. Then it stepped back, gestured into the darkness, as if inviting them to follow. Christopher's phone buzzed. Impossible. There'd been no signal. A text message, sender unknown. "Margaret wants to meet you." The figure waited, patient, certain of the outcome. "We could run," Tom whispered. "Get to the truck, drive to Gatlinburg. They know where we are. Equipment responds to them. Distance won't matter." Christopher stood, legs shaking. "They want something specific. If we refuse, they'll take it anyway. At least if we go willingly, we might learn something useful. Information that could help someone else." "That's suicidal. That's documentation. We're data points now, Tom. Might as well be useful ones." They followed the figure into the rain. It led them back up the muddy road toward the trailhead, moving with that broken puppet gait that no longer shocked Christopher's perceptions. The rain was stopping, clouds breaking up to reveal a moon 3 days past full. In its light, The forest looked different, older somehow, more primal. Other figures joined them along the trail. Christopher counted 11, all male, all with that same gray pallor flesh and wrong movements. They formed an escort, keeping pace effortlessly despite the steep terrain. None spoke. None needed to. Their intention was clear. The cemetery looked different under moonlight. The shadows were deeper, the stones more angular, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with something that wasn't quite life but wasn't death either. A strange vitality that made Christopher's skin crawl. A woman stood in the center of the cemetery beside the Dalka family plot. She wore a dress from the 1920s, simple cotton printed with flowers. Her hair hung in dark waves around a face that was both beautiful and terrible. Unlike the male figures, she moved naturally, gracefully, but her eyes held the same awful awareness. "Margaret Dalka," Christopher said. She smiled. It was a human smile this time, genuinely pleased. "You know me. You found my pattern. I wondered if anyone ever would." Her voice was accented, musical, and completely clear, none of the distortion the others produced. "Why?" Christopher asked. "Why 20 years? Why women that age?" "Because I was 24 when I lost them," Margaret said, gesturing to the 3 male graves. 24 when I learned that God was a liar and death was negotiable. The priest said I had to accept their loss. The old women in the village knew different. They remembered the old ways, the rituals from before Christianity drowned our beliefs. She walked among the stones, fingers trailing over weathered names. "I brought them back. My husband, my sons. I used the old words, the forbidden rites, and they came. But the spell has costs. It requires renewal. Fresh life to sustain dead flesh. Every 20 years, when the barrier between worlds grows thin, I must feed my family." "Megan Thornwood," Tom said. "Where is she?" Margaret's expression shifted to something like sympathy. "Where all the others are. Her life force sustains my beloveds for another cycle. She is part of them now. Part of us." "You're a murderer," Christopher said. 8 women dead so you can play house with corpses. 8 women who will never know my grief, who will never stand beside graves and scream at an empty sky. I gave them purpose." Margaret stepped closer. "And you, Christopher Hayes, you found the pattern. You saw the design in the chaos. That's no small feat. My invitation was specifically for you." "Invitation?" "I need someone to maintain the records, to ensure the cycle continues undisturbed. Someone who understands patterns, who can track the mathematics of eternity." She extended a hand. "Join us. Document our existence. You'll never die, never age. You'll witness the long patterns, the grand cycles ordinary humans cannot perceive." Christopher looked at the figures surrounding them, the shambling remnants of Margaret's family, animated by stolen life and forbidden ritual. He thought about the pattern, the perfect 20-year intervals, the statistical impossibility that had led him here. "No," he said. Margaret's smile faded. "You refuse immortality? The chance to transcend your limited perspective?" "I refuse to participate in murder. I refuse to become a thing that mimics life without understanding it." Christopher felt Tom tense beside him. "Kill us if that's your plan, but I won't help you." The figures moved closer, tightening the circle. Margaret studied him with an expression that might have been disappointment. "You could have seen such wonders," she said. "The patterns within patterns, the mathematics of souls, but you choose the same ignorance as all the others." She raised her hand, and Christopher knew this was the end. He'd traded data certainty for existential horror and was about to pay the price. Then Tom's Motorola radio crackled. A voice emerged, not the dispatcher, but multiple voices speaking over each other. English and Romanian, modern and ancient, living and dead. They said one word repeatedly. "Wait." Margaret froze. The figures stopped moving. From the forest, something approached. Christopher felt it before he saw it. a presence that made even the Strigoi seem trivial. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. His breath fogged. Ice crystals formed on the tombstones. An old woman stepped into the cemetery. She was tiny, bent with age, dressed in black, but her eyes were sharp, knowing, and when she spoke, even Margaret flinched. The old woman said something in Romanian. Margaret responded, her voice losing its confidence. A conversation unfolded that Christopher couldn't follow, but the body language was clear. The old woman was scolding Margaret like a disobedient child. Finally, the old woman turned to Christopher. "You will leave now. You will tell no one what you saw. In exchange, she will spare you." "Who are you?" Christopher asked. "I am the one who taught Margaret the rites. I am the reason she could bring her family back." The old woman's expression was unreadable, and I am the one who must maintain the balance. 8 lives in 80 years. That is the agreed price. No more. You're saying this is acceptable? 8 murders? I'm saying this is reality. The world contains more than your science acknowledges. Forces that predate your mathematics. Agreements struck in blood and salt. She gestured toward the trail. "Go. Live your limited years. And be grateful you're not the 9th. Tom grabbed Christopher's arm. "Come on. We're leaving." They walked backward out of the cemetery, neither willing to turn their backs on the figures. Margaret watched them go, her face showing something Christopher couldn't interpret. Regret, maybe, or envy. The male figures remained motionless, awaiting her command. When they reached the trail, the old woman called out, 2029, Christopher Hayes. Mark your calendar, and keep others away from this place when October comes. That is your purpose now, your pattern to maintain. They ran then, stumbling down the dark trail, branches whipping their faces, roots trying to trip them. Behind them, Christopher heard sounds, chanting, maybe, or simply the wind through the bones of trees older than memory. They made it to the truck. Tom drove like a demon, not speaking until they were back on paved roads, streetlights providing the comforting illusion of civilization. "What happens now?" Tom finally asked. "We report that Megan Thornwood disappeared on Turkey Pen Ridge Trail. We conduct a search. We find nothing. The case goes unsolved like all the others. That's it? We accept that reality is larger and stranger than we thought. We accept that there are patterns we can observe but not control. And we make sure that in 2029, no one dies on that trail in October." Christopher stared out at the passing darkness. That's the pattern now. That's what the data requires. Tom was quiet for a mile. Then, the old woman. She taught Margaret the ritual. Who taught her? I don't know. And I don't think I want to. Some patterns go deeper than we can follow. Some equations have variables we're not meant to understand. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Christopher spent the next 3 weeks documenting everything. Photos of the cemetery, GPS coordinates, copies of all the historical case files. He uploaded them to secure servers, created encrypted backups, wrote detailed reports that he knew no one would believe. But belief wasn't the point. Documentation was the point. Maintaining the record so that somewhere, somehow, the pattern would be visible to whoever needed to see it. Megan Thornwood's case closed unsolved. Her parents came to the park, devastated, demanding answers Christopher couldn't provide. Her boyfriend organized search parties that found nothing. Life moved on the way life does, forgetting tragedies as soon as the news cycle moved forward. But Christopher didn't forget. He transferred to a desk job in Knoxville, unable to face the mountains anymore. He set reminders in his calendar for October 2029 and began researching how to warn people away from specific locations without revealing information they'd never believe. Some nights he woke up remembering Margaret's face, the sadness in her eyes when he'd refused her offer. She'd been a woman destroyed by grief, who'd made a terrible bargain and spent 80 years honoring it. Were her actions evil? Yes, but were they also human? That was the question that haunted him. He thought about the pattern often. 20 years, 8 victims, statistical certainty emerging from supernatural horror. His career had been built on finding meaning in data, but now he understood that meaning was sometimes too terrible to acknowledge. The rational world continued around him. People lived, worked, died according to natural law. But underneath, Christopher now knew, ran currents of something older, forces that operated by rules written before science, before logic, before humanity, decided it understood the universe. He kept the Garmin GPS that had failed in the cemetery. Sometimes, late at night, he'd turn it on. The screen would flicker, and occasionally it would display coordinates, not his location, but a specific point in the Great Smoky Mountains, the Caldwell Cemetery. The numbers never changed. In 2029, he would return. He would stand at the trailhead and turn people away. He would maintain the pattern because that was his role now, his purpose in the grand equation Margaret had created. Some nights he wondered if that made him complicit. Other nights he accepted that morality was more complex than he'd believed, that preventing 9 deaths by allowing 8 was still a victory, however hollow. But most nights he simply stared at his data, at the perfect 20-year intervals, at the statistical impossibility that had proved to be devastating truth. And he understood finally that some patterns weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be witnessed, documented, and passed forward to whoever came next. The numbers didn't lie. They never had. He'd just been asking them the wrong questions. On October 19, 2024, exactly 15 years after Megan Thornwood disappeared, Christopher received an email. No sender, no subject line, just coordinates and a single sentence. The pattern remembers you. He deleted it, but he also updated his calendar, added new reminders, and began researching hiking traffic patterns for the Turkey Pen Ridge Trail in autumn 2029. Some patterns, once observed, couldn't be ignored. They became part of you. They waited in the mathematics, patient as death, certain as numbers. Christopher Hayes had found his pattern, and now the pattern had found him. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Christopher.